the Rockwell XFV12. Now, I feel really bad putting this plane on the list because it's kind of one of those situations where I'm like, man, does that look cool? And it does. I mean, it's got a really bold, futuristic design. Mind you, this was put into development in the late 70s, so it was a little ahead of its time when it comes to its angular dimensions going on here. And Rockwell, when they did make planes, unfortunately they're defunct now, they like to push the envelope a little bit, and they've had their successes. Like, they worked on the space shuttle for one, and, you know, the Rockwell B1 is a pretty great plane. But what happened here? Why did the XFV12 not do well? Well, there's a couple of reasons. When it was first proposed, the idea was for it to be a VTOL aircraft. VTOL means vertical takeoff and landing. You're probably familiar with the Harrier jump jet. That was probably the first real success when it came to this, because VTOL craft aren't actually helicopters. They are aircraft capable of flying both up and down as well as side to side at rapid pace. They can switch back and forth. A modern day example beyond the Harrier would be the F-35, which, while violently expensive, and I don't want to talk about that, did turn out to be able to do what it was supposed to do. So, you know, I guess money well spent. Oh god. I don't want to talk about it. But even before we purchased the Harrier over here in America, because yes, it was one of those rare cases where we were trying to do our own thing with the VTOL craft and not doing as good a job, so we just bought some Harriers. Rarely does that occur. We almost never do that, but we did. But before we bit the bullet on that, we were trying to make our own. It was a thing we were attempting to do. And the XFV12 was one of the attempts. Did it work out? Well, no. It's on the list. Stop asking that question. Why would I even present it? Like it's here. You know, like, one of these days I'm gonna surprise you and be like, actually it was great. Haha, I fooled you. No. The XFV12 was not great. There were two relatively minor issues with it. For one thing, the whole hovering thing. So through wind tunnel testing, they found that it should have been capable of, you know, the vertical takeoff and landing, but when they actually did tethered testing of this capability, they found that the thrust vectoring they were using, basically minimized the actual output of its engine, to the point that it actually couldn't lift its own weight. Not very well anyway, so that was bad. But the other issue is that even when it attempted normal flight, it was found to be really just not good at it. There were a ton of flaws in the overall design here, to the point that the Navy, which was the one funding the project, decided, wow, no, we're gonna cancel that. Yeah, it was canceled before it even did a normal test flight, flying like a regular plane, because they did not feel that it would even be able to do that at all. Although, the prototype did sort of survive into preservation. The cockpit section of the fuselage is still stored at NASA's Plumbrook Station in Ohio. A few years back there was talk of restoring it for a museum display, so maybe one day you'll be able to go see it. But beyond that, yeah, it was just kind of done away with, and we just bought some Harriers. It was just easier. It really was. The Republic XF84H Thunder Screech. Now, I call this the Thunder Screech, but to be honest, it was never officially designated the Thunder Screech. That's just what everyone called it on the ground, allegedly, because of reasons I'll get to. Now, some of you more knowledgeable about aircraft history may look at this and say, wait a minute, is this an F-84F Thunder Streak? And sort of. The Thunder Screech is derived from the F-84F Thunder Streak. The Thunder Streak was a plane that was good for its day, but it never was really given a chance to shine for a variety of reasons. Even when it was deployed, it very rarely got into air-to-air wars, and it just kind of occupied a weird space in history where there just wasn't a whole lot in terms of actual combat going on, at least when it came to air-to-air battles, which, to be fair, is probably just good in general. I think we should do more of not killing each other. But for this reason, this jet never really got a chance to show its stuff, not really being a bad design. Now, the Thunder Screech was an experimental version of the jet. Now, you may notice something odd about it, and in fact, that's its main feature, that this jet actually has something odd on the front of its nose. It was mounted with an XT40A1 turboprop engine. Why would they want to do this? Well, this was in the 1950s, and they'd only just started really adding jet aircraft to the military, at least when it came to America. They were still kind of new at the time. So the idea was to still test how well a turboprop could hold up when compared to a jet. And to be realistic, this particular engine type that they put in this thing was nothing to sneer at. This turboprop was insane. So powerful, in fact, that the tips of the prop itself actually broke the sound barrier. At full throttle, they could travel up to Mach 1.18. Very, very close to about 1,500 kilometers an hour. That's alarmingly fast for a prop to be going. Now, the problem with this, it was found, is that, well, it's twofold. First of all, you're probably wondering, where does the name Thunder Screech come from? Well, that is due to the horrific noise that was generated by this aircraft. Because the prop was traveling so fast, it was constantly breaking the sound barrier. You might be familiar with the concept of a sonic boom, the effect that occurs when something physical breaks the sound barrier, thus, well, booming. The prop was basically constantly doing that, and it was loud. Really loud. Like, to the point that allegedly, not concrete evidence for this, but allegedly it made people physically ill. They actually built 2 of these things and did some light testing. Test pilot Hank Beard actually took it up 11 times. 10 of those 11 times ended up in forced landings. Another test pilot, Lynn Hendricks, actually only flew it once, and then refused to ever fly it again. Now, recognize that this is a test pilot. These are the kind of dudes that willingly throw a jet into an out-of-control spin just to see if they could, you know, bring it back under control. And this man, Lynn Hendricks, thought that spending 1 more second in this aircraft was way too dangerous. The reason for this is that there was a horrific vibration issue when it came to the plane itself, which kind of makes sense when you consider the instability caused by sonic booms. It meant that the plane was super hard to control, though admittedly the Thunder Screech is relevant for being the fastest single-engine, propeller-driven aircraft ever built, with a design speed of at least 670 miles per hour, so that's neato. But in practice, it was a disaster. Believe it or not, one of the prototypes actually survived into preservation and is currently on display at the National Museum for the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. So if you want to go see it and not hear it, you can. So that's neato. The Boeing BA349 Matter. Oh boy. Oh, I'm getting into danger territory here. So let's talk about the end of World War II. Now, I think it's fair to say that by the time 1945 rolled around, for the Germans, things were going poorly. I think that's a fair statement. There's a lot to unpack there, but I'm going to avoid politics for the moment, or genocides, because I'm trying to be funny, and we don't have to talk about the horrible things going on. But we will discuss the technology they were utilizing in an attempt to somehow win the war. Understand that one of the major ideas of the technological push when it came to Germany in that era was the idea of a Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon. A wonder weapon is actually exactly what it sounds like. The thought was that they could create a weapon so powerful, so overwhelming, so impossible to counter, that it would almost single-handedly win the war for them. In practice, this isn't exactly how that works. Most weapons will have some inherent flaw or weakness that can be exploited, but Germany did go out of their way to produce an incredible array of different, sometimes wacky ideas when it came to weapons development. The V-1s and V-2 rockets were ahead of their times in many regards, but as effective weapons, that can be debated. Like, yes, they could fly and hit their targets, but they could be intercepted, and their ordnance ratio was nothing compared to what a bomber of that era could have done. There's also the German Tiger tanks, which, to be fair, are incredible tanks, especially for their era. Like, nothing in their time could win one-on-one against a German Tiger. The problem with them is that they never actually made enough of them to mean anything. So, that was not gonna work. Now, over on the Luftwaffe side, when it came to aircraft development, of course they were trying to do this kind of thing too. The Me-262 being the first operational jet fighter, but much like the Tiger, it did not show up soon enough in the war to actually make a difference. As you may have imagined with the V1s and the V2s, the Germans were experimenting with rocket technology. And the thought was, well, hey, what if we attach a rocket to a manned plane? That's a great idea. Now, there are two major examples of this. We're talking about the Matter, but there was also the Comet, which was also flawed, but was better than the Matter. The Matter had a bit of a bizarre design ethos that, in retrospect, was a little progressive in that it had no need for a runway, at least when it came to taking off, because it took off vertically like a rocket would. And from a defensive perspective, this is actually quite brilliant. You could get them in the air very, very fast, you wouldn't need an obvious and easy-to-bomb runway, and these things actually were equipped with rockets, so the pilot would take it into the sky, point it at whatever the target was, fire a volley of rockets, and then get out. So in concept, it's not necessarily the worst idea ever, but it is flawed, and the design itself was no. The problem with the Matter is, well, it's a few things. For one thing, the whole rocket plane is a questionable decision. For a combat aircraft, it's not really the best choice, especially at that time. The difference between the rockets they would have been using and a typical prop plane or a jet is, well, it's an issue of throttling. With a prop or a jet, you can throttle it up and down. You know, you turn on the jet, you know, you can throttle it up to max speed or middle speed or whatever speed you want. It's no different than giving gas to your car. With the rockets, they're either on or they're off. There is no in-between here. So you're either at maximum thrust literally all the time, or you're at nothing. And that's not really wise. There are many situations in air combat when you actually don't want to be going at full throttle. That actually happens a lot, especially when your targets would be relatively slow Allied bombers that the Matter was supposed to intercept. This meant that while it was rocketing off, the pilot would have very limited time to actually aim and fire. The design ethos at the time also meant that the pilots in question would be inexperienced, because they literally didn't have any experienced pilots left. A lot of the Luftwaffe aces were either dead or captured by this point in the war. They had no experienced pilots. So that meant they wanted inexperienced pilots to fly the Matter. That was one of the reasons they took off vertically, that way the pilot didn't have to learn to land or take off. Yeah, great. Except they have to still fly the thing, which is traveling faster than any other normal plane would. Its build quality was also just disgusting. The Matter was built out of parts that you wouldn't put into a normal plane, let alone one driven by rockets. Also, I'm sure you've noticed the whole wing issue here. The stubby, tiny wing thing, yeah, that's great too. But believe it or not, that had little to do with the Matter's problems. In glide tests, it was proven that it was perfectly fine when it came to flight. Like, it was small and light enough that those little wings could do the job to keep it in the air. It was just traveling at speed that was a problem. The whole thing tended to fall apart if the rockets actually ignited. As was proven when the first test pilot tried to take it up, the canopy actually snapped, smacking him in the face, killing him, and then the whole thing crashed. So that didn't go well. Documentation is hazy as to whether or not the Matter was ever actually truly deployed in the war. It was so late that it probably wouldn't have mattered. As planes and as combat aircraft, their poor production quality meant that they would have never ever worked out under any circumstances. But believe it or not, one original Matter did manage to survive and is currently on display at the Smithsonian in Maryland. So, yeah, you can see it. In fact, I've been there. I have seen it. It exists. It was a thing that they definitely built. They probably shouldn't have. The Sonsky IS. Oh boy. This is a fun one. So, now you're gonna have to bear with me. There are actually very few pictures of this thing, but the story is just too good to pass up for me. Sonsky was the name of the designer responsible for this plane, and he lived in Stalin-era Soviet Russia. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but Stalin was not a very nice person. His era in charge of the Soviet Union was wrought with the fear and depression and going to gulag a lot. But Sonsky decided that this was a really, really good time to try something that he was in no way qualified for. Sonsky had no experience designing planes, but he still tried to ask for authorization and funding from the Soviet military to produce one of his own. They agreed to this, somehow, likely because it was 1939 and, you know, World War II was kind of gearing up, so they wanted more planes, so they figured they'd just throw him a bone. Why not? You know, maybe he's a brilliant man. He's not. He's really not. Now, looking at it, it looks fine. Maybe nothing exciting, but, you know, fine. But Sonsky's design ethos is questionable, at best, actually. It was found that they messed up the measurements when it came to the gear in the initial design. The bays in the plane were actually too shallow to accept the wheels, so Sonsky shortened the wheels. The problem then was that the prop had already been measured out based off of the way the plane was supposed to be sitting, so the prop actually touched the ground when the tail was up. Now, Sonsky's solution to this was to literally take a hacksaw and cut the prop down so it fit. Now, understand that propellers on airplanes are specially made. Like, they're not something you can just kind of slap together. And it's not actually normal to just cut one with a hacksaw, which is what Sonsky did. The foreman in charge of the workshop that Sonsky was at was watching this entire display of ineptitude and actually forbade him from testing the plane on that workshop's runway. So Sonsky, who at this point it's clear has all the subtlety, tact, and finesse of a Siberian grizzly, simply took the IS to a different airstrip and had a test pilot in front of the Soviet military test the IS. So how did that go? Well, it went down the runway, went up, nearly crashed, and the pilot brought it back down almost immediately. After this display, Sonsky, believe it or not, actually got off alarmingly easy by Stalin-era Soviet Russia standards. He was simply banned from ever designing an aircraft again. Do not take hacksaws to your planes, pretty much ever. The Christmas bullet, sometimes called the cantilever aero bullet or the Christmas strutless biplane. Now, I bet you thought that just like the first part of the top 5 worst trains ever, the #1 spot would be inhabited by Soviet Russia. But no, I am an equal opportunity bad design finder, I guess. I don't know where I was going with that joke. You know, this is an American model. USA, USA, USA! We're #1! So there's some backstory here about the Christmas bullet. It was actually designed by one Dr. William Whitney Christmas, hence the name. It was not based off the holiday, just his name. Please recognize that William here is actually not a doctor of aeronautics or engineering or anything like that. He's a medical doctor who had no experience in aircraft design. And I'm not one to question doctors. You know, doctors, they go to school, they spend a lot of money on the school, they're very educated in you know, whatever specialty they specialize in. Like, no disrespect. I am a cancer survivor. My oncologist saved my life. I am not the type of person to throw shade at a doctor. But I'm gonna take a wild guess here, as someone who's never been to medical school, and say that aeronautics as a whole, not actually a course that's covered at all when you're going for a medical degree. It doesn't seem relevant. I'm actually having trouble thinking of something that could be further removed from, medicine, when compared to aeronautics. It just doesn't seem like something that's the same at all. But Dr. Christmas really seemed to think that, that he was brilliant at this. He founded the Christmas Airplane Company based in Washington, D.C. in 1910. He also said he previously designed at least 2 aircraft that were amazing, but you can't actually see them. But they were great. They were awesome. They were so cool. The best ever. Even though no one knows about them and there's no pictures or any documentation. But he said, I mean, look at him. Will he lie to you? Now, the Christmas bullet is one of the worst planes ever, if not the worst plane ever designed. And many people say it is, and there's a very good reason for that. Now, it's a biplane, so it has 2 wings. And looking at it, a cursory examination, to a regular person, it looks fine. I mean, there's nothing inherently special about it. From the get-go, I questioned the placement of the prop being down instead of up. You know, the fuselage seems really tall, but, like, whatever, I guess. Like, it looks fine. But, upon closer inspection, there is something very key missing here. Remember how I said one of the things they call it is the strutless biplane? Well, that's because biplanes have what are called struts, generally, in between the wings. Especially in that era. This is to keep the wings still. As air passes around an airfoil, it tends to want to move the airfoil, and unless the wing is made out of incredibly strong, rigid material, it's gonna move. Old school biplanes, and even modern biplanes, would have had struts in between the wings holding things together to anchor them down. It's normal for a wing to move a little bit in flight, but this was to prevent catastrophic movement. However, understand that this was Dr. Williams' brilliant design ethos. He, according to himself, believed that the whole point of the plane was to let the wings move around. And in fact, that was meant to be the control surface, was the flapping motion of the wings. Like a bird. There are many things wrong with that. For one thing, he seems to think that birds flap to fly. And that's true, but not in the way you might be thinking of. First of all, birds don't just flap their wings up and down. They actually have a very specific motion whenever they flap their wings. And when birds flap, it's less to maintain flight. Their wings do that on their own because they're natural airfoils. The flapping actually propels the bird forward. That's their version of a proper jet engine, is their flapping. That's why they do that. So, for a plane to do it, well, that's a little unnecessary because they have a prop. That's what the prop is for. So you don't actually need the plane to do that. But for the sake of the argument, let's say you actually made a plane that, you know, did that with its wings. You'd have to completely redo how planes are designed. Birds have hollow bones. They're incredibly light. And like I said, their wings move in a very specific way. So you would need to make your plane out of, like, the lightest material possible and add multiple points of articulation. That is a technical nightmare that I can only fathom. I don't even want to begin. And what purpose would that really serve? You're not really improving on the airplane's design then, you're just making it more work. Either way, it doesn't really matter because the Christmas did not take any of this into account. It literally just let the wings flap freely as the plane flew. This design feature caused the wings to warp horribly whenever it moved at all, which does not actually allow it to fly. Quite the opposite. It actually encourages it to crash. But Christmas, you know, it was really gung-ho. He got a whole bunch of investors behind him to try to make this thing possible. Although even one of the designers who was working for him was really concerned about this, saying that that absolutely would not work. And even if it was constructed like a normal plane, the materials they used to make the Christmas weren't actually aircraft grade. So even if it flew normally, it probably wouldn't do it for very long without something falling apart. That's good. The Christmas bullet took its maiden flight in January of 1919. Almost immediately, the wings actually came loose from the fuselage, and the plane crashed, which killed the test pilot, Cuthbert Mills. So that didn't go well. Now, a reasonable human being would have taken that unspeakable, overwhelming, obvious failure and say, okay, maybe I was wrong about that. But not Dr. William Whitney Christmas. He's a doctor. He knows everything. And he really insisted that this was gonna work. So, believe it or not, they built a second one and tested it again. This time on the 8th of March, 1919. And guess what? Basically the same thing happened, and it also killed another test pilot, Lieutenant Allington Joyce Jolly. So that's two people that are now dead because of, you know, the Hippocratic Oath says do no harm, and I feel like you've gone against that right now. And to this day, it's actually debated whether or not Dr. Christmas actually believed that this design was better, or if he was just trying to con people. Based off of the fact that he already lied about making other planes, it suggests to me that he may actually just be a con artist. And he never really thought the plane was going to work, he just wanted people to invest, then he could just run away with the money. And that's actually exactly what happened. Dr. Christmas was never actually charged with any wrongdoing. He was never criminally investigated as far as I can tell. He lived until 1960, dying of pneumonia at 94. You killed 2 people! For what? A flapping plane? I mean, come on, man! I'd love to give you the benefit of the doubt and say you genuinely believe that this would work because that it literally is the best case scenario here, but I'm starting to wonder if maybe you were just taking people for a ride and didn't care who got killed along the way. If so, that's kind of monstrous. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet. Ah, the Comet. The Comet's a bit more famous than the last rocket-powered plane I discussed, the Matter, but it has similar problems. And in its defense, though, I put it low on this list because if you look at it, it's actually got a very modern design, especially for the 1940s when it was manufactured by Germany for World War II. It's got swept-back wings, a very sleek fuselage. From a design standpoint, it's actually pretty revolutionary and very modern-looking. However, it's kind of a big case example for why we don't generally make rocket-powered aircraft. Now, last time I implied that rockets can't be throttled. And that's true, but only when it's using solid-state fuels. A liquid-state fuel rocket can be throttled, but A, it's still going to be a lot more unstable than a proper jet. But even if that wasn't an issue, in the Comet's case, well, it used, some fuel, yes, that definitely worked. It also definitely killed a whole bunch of test pilots. The later models of the Comet started using something called T-stop, or substance T. And it was basically stabilized high-test peroxide. Now, T-stop is very dangerous for just so many reasons, but the big one is that whenever it was combined with the oxidizer they used, C-stop, it resulted in an explosion. Now, in a controlled setting, this is, well, how they made it into a rocket. But the problem was, if the fuel tank was punctured at all, it would cause the aircraft to just explode. That's bad enough on its own, but several test pilots were killed because the fuel wound up leaking into the cockpit. Now, some sources will say the fuel was capable of dissolving people, and that word isn't inaccurate, but it's not exactly what T-stop does. Because dissolving sounds like it's like an acid and it's melting them. No, not that. It will cause a horrific chemical fire and burn them alive, though. That happened a lot. And even when the Comet was put into service, because it was only ever good for one thing. See, the Comet was extremely fast, capable of reaching 700 miles per hour. This was a problem for 2 reasons. One, that meant it was going way faster than the other Allied aircraft, and while that made them hard to hit, it also made it so that they had a hard time hitting the bombers they were supposed to be destroying. Problem 2, it was going fast, yes, but it would only fly between 7.5 to 8 minutes. Minutes in the air of powered flight. Now, they were great gliders once the engines shut off, but minutes? This meant that the Comet couldn't actually go places and do stuff and come back. They were only good for point defense, and even that was pushing it. They were expensive, and they only managed to shoot down 16 aircraft between all of them. Mind you, 370 Comets were actually built, so I think that they did not do basically any work, at all. Also, due to their fuel, they were actually hilariously easy to shoot down if a skilled Allied pilot could draw a bead on them. Cause yeah, they were blindingly fast and hard to hit. But if they were hit, the shot was basically guaranteed to ignite their fuel and blow them up. Despite having a revolutionary futuristic design, when it came to actual service, the Comet was worthless. The Boeing YB40 Flying Fortress. Now, hold on. That's not a B40. Duh. That's a B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the best bombers of its era. And yes, it is built off of a B-17, but no, this is a YB40. What's the difference, you may ask? Well, in a design ethos that I must admit is violently American, someone looked at the B-17 and said, hey guys, what if we didn't put any bombs on this at all, and just strapped all the guns in the universe to it? And they did, and it flew. The designers added just so many guns. I mean, just so many guns. 16 in total. And now you have a flying battle station of destruction. But what are you going to do with it? Well, the thought was that the B-40 could fly along with other bomber squadrons, like any B-17 would, and provide additional gunfire to defend them. The problem they had at the time was that escort fighters couldn't go as far as the bombers could. The P-51 Mustang could, but it was only just entering production at that point, so they weren't yet available for the missions at the time. The thought was if they just made one of the B-17s into all the guns in the universe, that should provide adequate protection. It did not. The issue was twofold. For one thing, all those additional guns and the ammunition to support them actually wound up being heavier than the bombs a B-17 would normally carry. The other problem was drag. Drag is a force that resists the movement of an aircraft in the air. All aircraft have some level of drag, it's just in the nature of aerodynamics. But you never want too much of it, as the aircraft either may not fly, or in this case, be cripplingly slow. The YB40 couldn't keep up with the regular B-17s, so it couldn't actually protect the bombers it was supposed to because it wasn't as fast as them. In this regard, it was effectively worthless. I mean, sure, it had a lot of guns, but if it wasn't there to see combat, then what was the point of it? It had only a small pittance of combat victories credited to it, and was quickly displaced by the time the Mustangs were put in the air. The Brada BA88 Lienche, or Lynx in English, is a pretty cool looking aircraft, I gotta say. It was introduced in 1939, and for that era it's sleek and fast looking, and during testing it established several world speed records. However, when it was deployed in World War II, and armament was actually added to it, a problem was realized regarding the old Lienche here. The issue with the Lienche is that while it performed well without any of the military equipment attached to it, the designers did not take into account the extra weight and drag guns and bombs would add to it. When they actually adapted it for the military purpose in World War II, the Lienche was completely useless. Half the time, it didn't actually take off at all because it couldn't get up to a proper speed. Its engines weren't powerful enough to compensate for the additional weight and drag. Attempts were made to make it work by removing the rear gunner and even trying to take off with half the fuel and bomb load, but it never really fixed anything. Too often, the squadrons taxi out to a runway, only to find out they couldn't take off in any way, and were therefore effectively worthless. The Brada was ultimately utilized as decoys for attacking aircraft on Italian airfields. They were just used to draw enemy fire at that point, because they couldn't actually be utilized for anything else. It's actually kind of embarrassing. How do you create a plane that can set world records, but also can't take off the second you add anything additional to it? It's kind of a cautionary tale regarding fighter aircraft design. You can't just design any old plane. You have to take into account every single piece of armament that plane's going to be carrying. Otherwise, you wind up in a situation where, in its base form, yeah, it's phenomenal. But the second you add a gun, it ain't going nowhere. The Mitsubishi G4M. And before I continue, yes, that Mitsubishi. They produced aircraft for the Japanese during World War II. It absolutely was a thing that occurred, just so we're clear. The Allied reporting name was the Betty for the G4M, so I'll probably just call it that the entire time. G4M was produced specifically for a need in the Japanese military to have a long-range, fast bomber to take on the advancing Allies. So I suppose you're thinking, oh, they didn't accomplish that at all. Well, technically speaking, they did. The G4M was fast, and it was capable of very long range. However, the way they accomplished this task was its major issue. See, in order to do this, they needed to make the aircraft as light as humanly possible. They removed any and all armor plating, so there was no protection for the crew, and most intriguingly, they removed self-sealing fuel tanks. Self-sealing fuel tanks are arguably a necessity on most aircraft, as their design prevents them from actually leaking, and therefore reducing the risk of, say, an explosion. However, they are heavier than regular old fuel tanks, so to reduce weight, they just didn't use the self-sealing ones, and they threw them into service on the 2nd of April 1941. And that was a complete disaster. Allied fighter pilots not only called it the Betty as the reporting name, but they also nicknamed it the Flying Lighter, because apparently it was extremely prone to just explode at the slightest provocation. A brief volley of machine gun fire and they were toast. And the problem wouldn't be fixed until later variants, the G4M2 and the G4M3, did come with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection to help the struggling bombers at least take a few hits. The LWS6 Zuba. Okay. You know, usually don't say this about things, whether it's a locomotive or an aircraft. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But I'm gonna be real with you guys, that's one of the ugliest planes I've ever seen in my life. And I don't even feel bad about it, because, wow. And in another rare instance, it actually looks how it flies. The Zuba is a Polish design. It was meant to be a twin-engine medium bomber. They only ever made 20 of them, because even when it was constructed, it was considered obsolete when compared to the PZL-37 Los that was meant for the same purpose, even though both aircraft cost the same to manufacture. As a result, the Zuba was constructed, but not for the purpose of bombing, because, frankly, it could barely do that. It was significantly underpowered. It also had several other faults. For example, the undercarriage had a habit of retracting during landing, which is the opposite of what you want to happen. Some crews actually flew with the undercarriage permanently locked down, specifically to avoid this problem. Weirdly enough, the Zuba wound up serving two other countries because Poland was invaded in 1939 by both Germany and the Soviet Union. Some were destroyed, but the Germans captured several of them and used them for blind flying training. The Soviets also got a hold of 4 of the planes and used them as communication aircraft, but in both cases they were considered mediocrity, barely worth it at all. And some sources say there was an incident where one simply fell out of the sky because someone opened the side door. Mind you, the Zuba's not a pressurized aircraft. Not at all. Therefore, opening the door mid-flight really shouldn't cause that kind of problem. But that could be hearsay, as I haven't been able to confirm that as fact or not. But either way, the Zuba was known to be a terrible, terrible plane, and probably shouldn't have even been put into production at all. But it showed up at just the right time because Poland needed planes. And it did serve to train some of their own pilots to defend their homeland, so I guess it wasn't a complete waste. The Blackburn B26 Botha. This 4-seat reconnaissance and torpedo bomber was produced by the British aviation company Blackburn Aircraft, who, admittedly, have produced some decent planes, but for some reason I feel like, especially during World War II, they really weren't that great at their job. Because if you saw the name Blackburn in front of any aircraft around that time, usually it was, at best, very questionable, and that was the case with the Botha. It first flew on the 28th of December 1938, and it was introduced just the following year, 1939. It was developed during the mid-30s in response to the Air Ministry's specification M15/35, and it was ordered straight off the drawing board, which is always alarming whenever I hear anything British and off the drawing board. During the official evaluation testing, stability issues were revealed, as well as the fact that it was hideously underpowered. As it turned out, it really wasn't that good, or anything. From a reconnaissance point of view, it was actually completely worthless, as the crew's view to the side or to the rear was basically non-existent due to the positioning of the engines. It could drop torpedoes and mines, but because of its poor performance overall, it was never really very good at that, and it was basically worthless if it was attacked by anything. By 1941, the air staff had had enough, and it was withdrawn from front-line service and used for secondary duties, mostly for training. But even at that, it wasn't very good. Some of them were actually converted to target tugs, which seemed about the only thing they were ever good for. As one test pilot put it, entry to the cockpit is difficult. It should be made impossible. The Tupolev TU-144. Now wait a second, isn't that the Concord? Well, no, this is the Soviet version of the Concord, a supersonic passenger airliner that was designed by Tupolev that was in operation from 1968 to 1999. It actually beat the Concord to its first flight, which took place on the 31st of December 1968. That was 2 months before Concord took off. Additionally, it was larger and faster, but that was about all it was good for. Because, frankly, they were pieces of junk. The Soviets had rushed production in order to be the first in the world to have a supersonic airliner. The problem with that is that, well, there wasn't enough time taken to actually test the problems that it obviously was going to have. Early flights with it showed serious reliability issues. During 102 flights, and about 181 hours of freight and passenger flight time, it suffered more than 226 failures. 80 of those were in flight. Due to these issues, many flights had to be cancelled or rescheduled, which definitely frustrated passengers. It was also found that the airframe was subject to fatigue cracking, which is never a good thing for any airplane, let alone one that would be subjected to supersonic forces. And they were loud, like really loud. Like not just in the supersonic nature of the sonic booms and not being able to fly over regular cities because of the noise complaints. No. I mean inside the cabin. The 144 could only sustain supersonic speeds by use of afterburners like a military aircraft. The Concorde didn't do that. As a result, the noise in the cabin was outrageous, and allegedly those seated 2 seats apart could not actually hear each other even if they screamed, and had to pass handwritten notes instead. It was ridiculous. And it never made sense from an economic point of view either. For the Soviet Union, well, they were communist. We know that. Everyone knows that. That's pretty common knowledge. And in a communist society, there aren't really any rich people. That's not how that's supposed to work. The Concorde only got away with what it did because it marketed itself as a high-class, high-priced, first-rate experience. Something for the ultra-wealthy, who could travel in comfort and at speed. The 144 could never be marketed that way. They literally weren't even allowed to charge extra for the tickets. So having something like this in a communist economy was not going to work. It couldn't even make enough money just to break even, let alone make a profit at all. Oh yeah, and one crashed at the 1973 Paris Air Show, which was not a good look at all. The Curtiss SO-3C Semu, sometimes called the Seagull by the US Navy, but that was the name of the plane it was meant to replace, the SOC Seagull, which makes it really confusing, and the Royal Navy kept calling it the Semu. I'm gonna stick with the Semu just to avoid confusion. This thing first flew on the 6th of October 1933, manufactured by the Curtiss-Wright Corporation, and it sucked. It was literally inferior to the plane it was supposed to replace. Mind you, the Seagull, if you haven't already noticed, was a biplane. This is a monoplane, a modern one, but it had a lot of issues early on, and continued to have them. For one thing, other than the fact that they don't really look like the most attractive planes in the world, they had serious stability issues that were only partially solved, but the real issue was the engine. The engine was, quite frankly, the dumpster fire of an engine. It was a unique design, air-cooled, and in an inverted V shape. Also, it was an inline engine, not a radial engine that a lot of prop planes were finding far more useful. The Semu, no matter what they did to it, always seemed way more lethal for the pilots than for any enemy combatants. Mind you, its role was just to be a standard float plane scout launched off of a catapult, but the Royal Navy started calling them Sea Cows. Their standard fuel tank actually held 300 gallons, but they never took off with more than 80, because anything beyond that would be too heavy for them. The tail also had to be raised before they went airborne, because if it wasn't, it was possible to take off in an altitude from which it was both impossible to recover and in which there was no aileron control. Which sounds horrifying, actually. They were garbage, regardless of whether the US Navy or the Royal Navy was using them. They were declared obsolete in September of 1944, and finally removed from service in 1945 for the Royal Navy. The US Navy, towards the end of World War II, wound up replacing them with the very plane they were supposed to replace, the SOC Seagulls, because the Seagulls at least weren't killing their own pilots. The Royal Aircraft Factory BE9. What kind of horror show are you showing to me now? Only one of this experimental aircraft was ever built, and it first flew on the 14th of August, 1915. It's based very, very closely on the BE2C. The major difference being, that thing right there. Okay, why is that there, and why is the prop behind it? I will answer this question. The idea of this experiment was to combine the high performance of a tractor configuration aircraft, which is just a conventional prop plane, one with the prop in the front, as opposed to a pusher, which has the prop behind, with a good field of fire for the observer's machine gun. Now, that's not unreasonable. You want to make sure the observer can see where they're shooting, and the prop can get in the way of that, I understand. Yep. So, their solution was to add a literal tiny wooden box right in front of the aircraft's propeller, which was eventually nicknamed the pulpit, presumably because the occupier would be praying to God constantly, as they would be consistently reminded that they could die at any moment. The gunner would be armed with a Lewis gun on a trainable mount. But this was an awful, horrifically dangerous idea. The pilot was probably fine, but the person in the gunner's seat was at risk of so many things. Even in the mildest of crashes, they could easily be crushed by the giant engine immediately behind them. Also, and this is probably relevant, what if a piece of clothing, or their hand, or anything, gets caught in the deadly whirling blades? What if that happens? Tell me, what if that happens? I think you know how that's going to work, and it wouldn't go very well. The only prototype was actually sent for field testing, but the opinions that surrounded it were generally negative. From a performance perspective, technically it really wasn't that much different from the BE2C, which had been fine, but the overwhelming danger factor for the gunner was just too much of a risk. No one wanted to be in that box, ever, under any circumstances. They were going to die. They should be thankful that, due to this, it never actually entered full production, as it was also partially rendered irrelevant due to the invention of synchronization gears. This device enabled a single-engine tractor configuration aircraft to fire armament through the arc of the spinning propeller without bullets hitting the blades. Therefore, there was really no need to mount a random person in front of said blades. The Caproni CA60. Okay, no, I shouldn't laugh. I should not laugh, because it was 1921. And there was still a lot people were learning about what worked when it came to airplanes, particularly airliners. The idea of passenger airplanes, large-scale passenger airplanes, was very much in its infancy. And Gianni Caproni was an Italian aviation pioneer who was instrumental when it came to developing the Italian aviation industry. So I don't want to come down too hard on him, because he was coming from a good place here, but this was never going to work. This was never, ever going to work. But believe it or not, it did fly. I don't know how, but it did. There's a lot of problems with this idea, because his thought was that he actually wanted this to be a transatlantic airliner. Why would he put 9 wings on it then? Well, it had 8 engines, which sounds like a lot because it is, but his thought was actually that if one of the engines failed, there would still be enough to keep the aircraft airborne as a safety feature. And to be fair, in the modern day airliner scene, well, yeah, if they lose one, the other one is powerful enough to keep them going. That's a normal design idea. So Caproni was on the right track, just not with this. This was not going to work. He thought a flying boat configuration would make it easier for them to, land in pretty much any situation. And he thought the aircraft could land in the middle of the Atlantic and refuel, thus allowing it to traverse the entire ocean. That was probably not going to work that well, because a flying boat requires calm seas to land safely. And the ocean does whatever it wants. You couldn't guarantee the ocean was going to be calm. So if this thing needed to land, possibly more than once, to get across the ocean, that could be an issue. There were 2 test flights regarding this thing. And the first one, yeah, it did fly briefly. The aircraft was apparently very stable in the air according to the pilot, and the controls were, believe it or not, responsive, which I still have trouble believing, but that's apparently how it went. The second flight test did not go quite as well, and according to the test pilot, he accelerated the aircraft to about 100 kilometers an hour, and pulled the yoke toward himself. But suddenly, it took off and started climbing in a sharp nose-up altitude. Way too much. He reduced throttle to try to fix that, but then the aircraft's tail started falling. It hit the water tail first, and the whole thing broke apart. Fortunately, he and the flight engineers survived. There were 2 causes looked into when it came to what happened. It was believed that, for one thing, the wake of a steamboat that was navigating on the lake nearby was thought to have interfered with the takeoff. Secondly, the test pilot may have pulled the yoke too much, when he should have performed corrective maneuvers instead. More recent theories say that perhaps the sandbags that had been put on board to simulate the weight of passengers weren't actually fastened, and they may have slid to the back of the fuselage when the aircraft took off and caused it to tip up way too sharply. But to be honest, the biggest issue has to do with the design itself. There's a reason we don't generally put wings on aircraft like this. The aerodynamics involved actually mess with the airflow over the following wings. It's still considered one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built, due to how much went into the design, and several fragments are actually still around on display at several different museums. So, at least that's something.